Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're stepping softly into one of the most mysterious corners of human history. The quiet places where people, entire families, whole villages simply disappeared. No storms, no screams, no chaos, just unfinished journeys, unlocked doors, warm meals left behind, footprints ending in fresh snow, and stories that slipped gently into the dark without explanation. These aren't the loud mysteries you see in movies. These are the soft ones, the unsolved disappearances that whisper instead of shout, the ones that linger in old journals, fading newspapers, and half-remembered reports from coastlines, mountains, and silent roads. Tonight, you and I will drift through 8 of the most haunting unsolved cases in history. Ghost ships, vanished families, empty towns, missing passengers, winter footsteps, explorers swallowed by fog, planes that never landed, and the last quiet imprint of a life in the snow. Not to frighten you, but to slow your breath, to remind you how strange, quiet, and tender this world can be when stories simply fade instead of ending. So, before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes, let the night soften around you, and follow me into the deep, quiet world of the most mysterious disappearances in history. In the middle of a calm, open sea, a ship was found drifting. Dinner still on the table. Coffee still warm. Every person on board gone. That's our hook for tonight. And as soft waves carry us deeper into this quiet mystery, I want you to settle into your breath, loosen your shoulders, and allow the night to dim the noise around you. Because this story, one of the most whispered ghost ship mystery cases in maritime history, has the gentle kind of eeriness that never raises your pulse, only stirs your curiosity. It is one of the most famous unsolved disappearances of its time, a case cited in investigation logs and maritime safety manuals across the century. Not because it was violent or frightening, but because nothing about it made sense in a way investigators could measure. The ship was a mid-sized merchant vessel, sturdy, well-built, and known for crossing that route many times without trouble. The morning it was found, the weather was described as strange but not dangerous. Thick clouds stretched low across the horizon, blurring the line between sky and sea. The wind moved slowly, as though hesitating. Visibility had dropped, not enough to alarm sailors, but enough to make the world feel smaller, quieter, slightly unreal. Details that will echo again later tonight when we reach Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. The coordinates where the ship drifted were logged carefully by the rescue crew. At the time, no one paid attention to that set of numbers, but decades later, other investigators circled them in red ink as they reviewed a different case, a civilian plane that vanished just north of that same stretch of water. Tonight, We will gently plant that connection like a seed, and will return to it when the time is right. But for now, let's stay with the ship, floating alone on a sea that looked too calm to hold a mystery. When the rescue team boarded, the silence struck them first. Not the heavy, dreadful kind of silence, but something thinner, softer, as though sound itself had stepped aside. A pot of coffee still sat on the table, steam barely rising as if it had been warmed not long ago. Plates of food were arranged neatly, untouched, waiting for hands that would never return. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned chair, no broken rail, not even a dropped spoon to mark panic or haste. Everything sat exactly where human life had placed it. Only the humans were missing. The logbook, found open in the captain's quarters, had entries as normal as the sea conditions that morning. Nothing foreshadowed danger. Nothing hinted at fear. The last note mentioned a shift in the wind and a faint fog rolling in, but nothing alarming. Yet somewhere between that written line and the moment the rescue team stepped aboard, the entire crew vanished, as though the ocean had inhaled them. That strangeness settled deeply into investigators' minds, the feeling of a story paused mid-sentence. And here, in the calm of tonight, I want you to rest on that thought for just a moment. This is the first time in our journey where a path suddenly ends without explanation, but it will not be the last. Let your breathing slow gently as we drift farther into the heart of this ghost ship mystery, one of history's quietest, most baffling unsolved disappearances, whispered across decades and revisited in countless boring history for sleep nights, letting curious minds wander while heavier thoughts slip away. As the rescue crew moved deeper into the ship, a strange stillness followed them down every corridor, as if the air itself remembered what had happened, but refused to speak. Their footsteps echoed softly against the wooden floors, each tap of a boot sounding too loud for a place that should have been bustling with life just hours earlier. One of the investigators later wrote that walking through the ship felt like moving through a paused world, as though time had stepped aside and left everything suspended in an unfinished moment. In the crew's quarters, beds were made, neatly tucked, as if the men had planned to return after a routine meal. A jacket hung on a hook beside a doorway, the sleeves gently swaying as the sea breeze slipped through an open window. A child's drawing, no one knew whose, was pinned near a bunk, its lines shaky from the ship's gentle movements. These small traces of ordinary life made the absence feel even stranger, almost tender in its mystery. The captain's room revealed even more. His logbook, still open, contained a final entry describing a shift in the air pressure and an unusual fog rising from the horizon. No panic, no alarm, just an observation made by someone who had lived his entire life on the water. His pen lay neatly beside the book, as if he intended to continue writing. The crew roster, stored in a drawer, showed no unusual changes. Every name accounted for, every position filled. Yet not a single person remained. When investigators reached the deck once more, they paused before the lifeboats. All were still secured in place, untouched. That detail alone puzzled them more than anything else. In emergencies, trained sailors would never hesitate to deploy a lifeboat. For none to be used suggested that whatever happened was sudden but not violent, urgent but not chaotic. One investigator described it as the kind of moment where everyone steps outside at once to look at something, a poetic explanation, though no one could imagine what that something might have been. Some theories, whispered through time, spoke of a massive waterspout approaching silently through the fog, or a sudden gas leak from the ship's cargo. But neither theory explained the warm coffee, the untouched meal, the complete lack of distress. It was as if the crew simply walked away without fear, almost willingly. And yet the sea, calm and gentle around the drifting vessel, held no answers. The weather that morning remained unsettlingly mild, a strange stillness in the wind, thick clouds moving without urgency. No lightning, no waves, no threat. Just a world wrapped in muted gray. That same atmospheric oddness, the quiet fog, the sluggish wind, will return later tonight in Chapter 6, when an explorer steps into a similar haze and disappears into it. And again in Chapter 7, when a civilian plane enters a sky that seemed perfectly calm until it wasn't. These echoes across different stories are gentle reminders that history, even in its strangest moments, often repeats its quiet patterns. As the rescue team continued searching, they noticed scratch marks near the helm. Not violent, not desperate, more like guiding lines carved by someone thinking, someone pacing, someone hesitating. A pair of binoculars lay on the deck, lenses pointed toward the sea, as if the last person to hold them dropped them mid-thought. One of the investigators lifted them, stared into the direction they had been pointing, and saw only a wall of gray mist. If they saw something, he later said, it stayed invisible to us. By late afternoon, after hours of searching every cabin, every storage space, every shadowed passage, the crew finally stepped back onto their rescue vessel with more questions than answers. They described the ship as holding the gentle sadness of an unfinished story, a place where life had left quietly but completely. And as night slowly began to settle around the drifting vessel, the investigators watched it for a long moment, letting the mystery sink in. A ship without a soul, a journey interrupted, a story with its middle missing. And as you breathe a little softer, letting the quiet of this moment settle around you, remember this. The sea forgets quickly, but mysteries like this linger, not to frighten, but to remind us how delicate the line is between presence and absence, between a life unfolding and a life suddenly paused. By the time the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky with quiet shades of gold and fading blue, the rescue crew had accepted a truth they could not explain. The ship would offer them no answers. It would only give them silence. One of the senior investigators suggested towing the vessel back to the nearest port, hoping that experts on land might uncover something they could not. And so, with gentle ropes secured and engines humming softly, the rescue team began guiding the empty ship toward shore. Even then, the sensation of being watched lingered, not in a frightening way, but in a curious, spectral way, as if the ship itself wondered where its people had gone. As evening deepened, fog returned, rolling in slowly from the west. It thickened around both vessels, soft and pale, dimming the world until everything was wrapped in a muted glow. The rescue crew noted how the fog felt strangely familiar, the same kind the captain had described hours before he vanished. It drifted across the deck like a memory, brushing against metal railings and coiling around the ropes like invisible fingers. Some members of the crew later admitted they felt a quiet pressure in the air, not dangerous, just heavy, as though the sea had been holding its breath for too long. And still the ship drifted obediently behind them, heavy with its mystery. When they finally reached the harbor lights that night, glowing faint and steady through the mist, a crowd of curious onlookers and maritime officials were already waiting. News traveled quickly in coastal towns, and a ship returning without a single soul aboard was an event people whispered about for generations. The vessel was secured to the dock, its empty hull knocking gently against the wood, the sound strangely rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. Officials boarded immediately, moving methodically through every room, every deck, every hidden compartment. But they found nothing new, not a sign of struggle, not a clue, not the faintest trace of where dozens of human lives had gone. The crime scene remained undisturbed, untouched by anything but time. In the days that followed, investigators constructed timelines, rechecked weather logs, contacted families, traced cargo routes, and examined every piece of equipment aboard. They found no mechanical failure, no poisonous materials, no evidence of mutiny. Theories rose and fell like tides: pirates, mass hallucination, a sudden rogue wave, a coordinated escape attempt, even uncharted underwater tremors. But each was dismissed. They were too dramatic, too forced, too inconsistent with the gentle scene the ship presented. Eventually, officials labeled the case an unresolved maritime event, a phrase so vague it admitted defeat without admitting confusion. The ship itself was eventually reclaimed, repaired, even reused, but sailors whispered that it carried an energy they did not like, a quiet melancholy, as though it had once witnessed something it could never describe. Some refused to sleep aboard it. Others said they woke to the sound of soft footsteps in hallways that should have been empty. Whether those were dreams, tricks of the mind, or echoes of memory, no one could say. And yet the ship sailed again, crossing the same waters where it once drifted alone. In the decades that passed, stories about it faded into maritime folklore, resurfacing only in late-night conversations, old investigation journals, and quiet retellings meant to soothe restless minds. Tonight, as you lie here and drift with this story, I want you to notice how gentle its mystery feels. No violence, no chaos, no fear, just a moment in history paused, like a single breath held for too long. This ghost ship mystery, one of the softest yet most enduring unsolved disappearances of its time, reminds us that not all secrets of the sea are meant to be frightening. Some are simply meant to drift, slowly and silently, like a thought you almost remember but can't quite grasp. Before we move to Chapter 2, breathe in slowly and let it go. Let the last image of the empty ship fade like fog dissolving into moonlit water, because in the next story, a home falls silent overnight, and the sea will not be the one holding the unanswered questions. The neighbors saw the lights go out at 10 p.m., just like every other night. By sunrise, the beds were empty, the door was unlocked, and the family was history's secret. That is where we begin tonight. Inside a quiet little town tucked away far inland, yet not so far from the coastline where the drifting ghost ship of Chapter 1 was found. Close enough that if you looked at a map, your eyes could drift from one mystery to the other in a single slow movement. A strange decade, investigators would later call it, a time when both sea and land seemed to swallow people from ordinary life without leaving even the courtesy of a clue. The family lived in a small two-story house at the edge of this inland town, a place known for its stillness, its predictable rhythm, the kind of community where nothing ever changed except the seasons. Their home was simple, warm, and always lit the same way each evening, a lamp in the living room, a softer glow upstairs, and the faint sound of dishes drying by the kitchen window. Neighbors often described them as steady people, the kind who waved every morning, kept their garden tidy, and never missed a Sunday walk along the small river behind the town. That night, the night everything changed, was utterly ordinary, at least on the surface. Around 10 p.m., the neighbors saw the lights click off, one by one, exactly as they had for years. No shouting, no unusual visitors, no sounds that would settle into the memory of anyone in the town, just darkness folding gently over a house preparing for sleep. But by sunrise, something subtle and deeply unsettling had shifted. The milk delivery boy was the first to sense it. He noticed the kitchen door wasn't latched properly, just resting against the frame. Not broken, not forced, simply unlocked. A detail small enough to ignore, but strange enough to whisper to the mind. Unlocked doors will appear again tonight in another form, on a moving train, when a passenger steps away from his seat and never returns. For now, though, it was just the first thread in this family disappearance mystery, the first sign that something was quietly wrong. When the neighbors grew concerned and finally stepped inside, they found the house strangely peaceful, as though frozen in the routine of a morning that never arrived. Breakfast plates were neatly set out on the table, 4 settings, arranged with the care of a family preparing for another ordinary day. A loaf of bread rested on a cutting board, unsliced. A kettle filled with water sat on the stove, waiting for a flame that was never lit. Upstairs, the beds were perfectly made but untouched. Sheets pulled tight, pillows fluffed just the way the mother was known to arrange them. Clothing for the next day hung over chairs, ready for school and work. Shoes sat in pairs by the door. The dog, usually barking at the first sign of a stranger, was nowhere to be found. Nothing was chaotic, nothing was out of place, nothing was missing, except the family themselves. No packed bags, no opened windows, no signs of struggle. Just a house paused mid-life, mid-routine, mid-breath. Investigators searching later that morning noted the eerie calm that settled through the rooms, a quiet that felt different from the silence of an empty home. It was the quiet of something unfinished, something gently interrupted. And as the search expanded beyond the house, into the yard, the nearby woods, the river path, they found no trail, no footprints, no hint of where 4 lives had walked away. It was as though they stepped out of their home and were swallowed by a kind of invisible stillness. One newspaper headline captured the feeling perfectly. A family lost between one breath and the next. Tonight, as you sink deeper into this story, let your breath slow. The mystery is soft, not sharp, gentle, not frightening. A strange, vanishing case, yes, but one told in whispers, in pauses, in the spaces where ordinary life simply fades like morning frost under the first touch of sun. When investigators arrived later that morning, they moved carefully through the small home, noting every detail as though the house were whispering clues too soft for ordinary ears. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting gentle stripes across the breakfast table, where 4 plates waited patiently, symbols of a morning that never began. The air inside felt undisturbed, still carrying the faint scent of soap from dishes washed the night before. Nothing was overturned. No drawers were open, no signs of hurried departure. It was the quiet that bothered them most. Not an empty quiet, but the quiet of a story interrupted. They walked upstairs next. Each bedroom held its own strange tenderness. The children's room was the most haunting, not because anything gruesome lay there, but because it was so heartbreakingly normal. A school backpack half-zipped, a book left open on a desk, a wooden toy resting on the windowsill, worn smooth from being held many times. A drawing taped to the wall showed a family of 4 beneath a bright yellow sun, the kind of picture every child draws, filled with love and certainty. Investigators paused, feeling the weight of the room's innocence. How does an entire family vanish from such a gentle life? The parents' room offered no more clarity. Clothes neatly folded at the foot of the bed. A calendar on the wall marked with small, hopeful notes. Doctor's appointment next week. Birthday party on Saturday. A reminder to fix the garden gate. All the tiny threads of an ordinary life woven together, waiting to be lived. Downstairs, the unlocked door remained the most unsettling detail. It was not broken or forced, just unlatched. Open enough to suggest a departure, but too calm to suggest panic. Investigators gently tested its hinges, the way a doctor checks a patient's pulse. Slowly, carefully, respectfully. They recorded in their notes, no defensive marks, no forced entry, no sign of intrusion. Door simply unlocked. That pattern, as we said earlier, will return tonight. A door left unsecured on a moving train. A moment of transition. A silent exit. These repeating shapes, doors open without explanation, became clues not of what happened, but of how quietly these disappearances occurred. The search expanded outward. Neighbors were interviewed, the mailman, the store clerk, the elderly woman who often sat on her porch knitting, all were asked if they had seen or heard anything unusual. Every answer was the same. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. It was as if the family had been gently lifted out of their lives without disturbing a single blade of grass. Search dogs were brought in. They sniffed the yard, the nearby woods, the riverbank, but their trails ended abruptly at the family's own front door, as though the scent simply dissolved into thin air. One of the handlers later said it was like they vanished between one step and the next. Investigators turned to the timeline. The lights had gone off at 10 p.m. The milkman arrived shortly after sunrise. At most, a 7-hour window. But within that small stretch of time, when the world is at its quietest, the family had disappeared without using a vehicle, without alerting anyone, without leaving a mark. Newspapers began printing headlines within 2 days. A home without footsteps. The longest night in town history. And the most quoted of all, a family lost in their sleep. Journalists pointed out something eerie. The disappearance occurred during the same decade as the ghost ship from Chapter 1. Different places, different circumstances, but the same strange rhythm. Lives interrupted mid-routine. It was as if the world had pockets of emptiness, swallowing people in gentle, impossible ways. As evening fell on the second day of the search, investigators found one final detail that etched itself deeply into their memories. On the kitchen counter lay a small handwritten note, likely a child's. It said, "School trip tomorrow," with 3 excited exclamation marks. The tomorrow they never reached. Tonight, as you relax deeper into your pillow, imagine the softness of these mysteries. No violence, no chaos, just ordinary lives paused, like pages in a book where the words simply stopped halfway through a sentence. By the 3rd day of searching, the small inland town had transformed into a silent gathering place of unanswered questions. People stood on porches, holding warm mugs between their hands, whispering the same thought to each other. How does a whole family disappear without leaving footprints? Investigators continued their work with a soft determination, moving slowly through each room again, as if a second look might reveal something the first had missed. But the house remained unchanged, frozen in its own quiet pause. On the kitchen table, the breakfast plates still waited, untouched, unmoved. A silent reminder of a morning that never began. Outside, the early autumn air carried a crispness that made every sound more noticeable.
The distant rustle of leaves, the soft hum of telephone wires, the quietness of a neighborhood holding its breath. Search teams combed through the nearby woods once more, retracing old paths, marking the ground with gentle steps so they would not disturb anything fragile. But there was still nothing. No torn fabric, no disturbed soil, no footprints, no signs of a struggle. The world around the house looked completely unaware that 4 people had left it. When investigators turned their attention to the family's routines, hoping to find a thread that might explain their disappearance, all they discovered was normalcy. The father worked at a small hardware store. The mother volunteered at the town library. The children attended school, earned average grades, played in the park on weekends. There were no debts, no conflicts, no medical issues, no travel plans. Nothing to suggest they intended to walk away from their lives. It was a strange vanishing case precisely because it lacked the drama that usually accompanies disappearances. Nothing pointed outward. Nothing pointed inward. It was as if the family's lives simply folded quietly into the night. Investigators revisited the unlocked door, the single detail that refused to be ignored. It hinted at movement, but not fear. It suggested departure, but not urgency. One detective wrote in his report, "A door left open is a moment left open, a transition without closure." That same sentence would later be quoted during the investigation of the passenger who stepped away from his train seat in Chapter 4. Patterns, subtle but undeniable, began to thread themselves across these stories. Doors unlatched, routines left unfinished, lives paused without warning. When the newspapers arrived with fresh editions on the 4th day, their headlines grew more poetic than factual. A family lost between night and morning. 4 lives missing in the quietest way possible. And my favorite, the house that kept waiting. Journalists pointed out, again, that this disappearance took place during the same decade as the ghost ship of Chapter 1, a decade strangely marked by disappearances gentle in nature, but impossible in explanation. On the 5th day, investigators discovered one detail that stayed with them for the rest of their careers. On the edge of the river path behind the town, the same path the family walked every Sunday, stood a single object, a children's scarf caught on a thorn. But the scarf was clean, unweathered, as though placed there gently rather than torn off by accident. It offered no answers. If anything, it deepened the mystery. "A clue that refuses to be a clue," one officer murmured. After that, the search slowly quieted. Theories began to settle instead of rise. Some whispered they had run away, but there was no reason. Others suggested they were taken, but there was no trace. A few believed they wandered into the woods and became lost, but the land had been searched countless times. Most locals said the same thing. The family simply vanished between moments, slipped into a silence too soft for the world to catch. And that idea, that quiet vanishing, stayed in the collective memory of the town. Even decades later, the house stood exactly as it was on the morning they disappeared, carefully preserved by new owners who refused to change the layout of the rooms. "It feels like they could walk back in at any moment," one of them said. Tonight, as we close Chapter 2, let this thought rest gently in your mind. This disappearance is not violent, not chaotic, not loud. It is a story paused, a life interrupted mid-breath, a breakfast uneaten, a tomorrow that never arrived, a mysterious disappearance that echoes the ghost ship before it and whispers toward the next chapter, where an entire town slowly empties as though following the same silent rhythm. Take a slow breath. Let your body soften. And when you're ready, we'll continue.
No sirens, no panic. Just one house empty, then another, until the village map was still there, but the people were not. This is where our journey drifts next, into a quiet valley village whose disappearance was so gradual, so gentle, that historians still struggle to mark the exact moment when life truly ended there. What we do know is this: the village once had a population of 847. Not a large number, not a tiny one, just enough for children to echo through the fields, for the church bell to ring each Sunday, for a warm glow to shine from windows when night settled early in winter. And yet, in the span of just a few years, that number slowly fell toward zero. No crisis, no mass departure, no newspaper headline, just a soft, steady emptying that no one noticed until it was too late. The village lay along a remote inland road, the same long, lonely route that, decades later, an explorer would follow during the final hours before he stepped into the fog and vanished. A story waiting for us in Chapter 6. But for now, imagine this place before the silence took hold. A small schoolhouse with chipped blue paint. A marketplace square where farmers sold jars of honey and woven baskets. Houses built from pale stone that caught the first morning light in gentle gold. At a glance, it looked like any other rural community. But as time passed, a strange stillness crept in, so subtle that villagers barely recognized it. A family moved away to find work in a nearby town. Then another followed. No urgency, no fear, just practical choices made in ordinary lives. Yet when the population dipped to around 600, something shifted. People began leaving abruptly. A house left empty one week would be joined by another the next. Gardens wilted, unwatered. School attendance thinned until desks sat untouched. The church choir faded from 20 voices to 6, then to none at all. Those who remained dismissed it as coincidence. People move, they said. Times change. But underneath those calm explanations, a rumor drifted quietly among the elders. Whispers that long ago they had read about a ship found at sea with no crew aboard, a tale that had unsettled them more than they had admitted. a ghost ship story carried inland like a cold wind. Some said mysteries traveled in patterns, like migrating birds. Others said silence had a way of spreading, moving from place to place until it found a new home. Whether superstition or memory, the rumor lingered. And still, the village emptied. By the time the population reached around 200, passing travelers noticed the vacancy more than the residents did. Doors left open, curtains swaying in hollow houses. A swing in the playground drifting slightly as if recently used, though no children lived nearby anymore. But no sirens ever sounded, no town meeting was called, no panic swept through the streets. It was the softest unraveling imaginable. Life simply dimming, room by room, house by house. When the village population finally reached 0, no one marked the date. No official declared it abandoned. It simply was. A map with names of streets that no longer echoed with footsteps. A place left behind by the world. Tonight, as you rest deeper into this sleep story, imagine the gentle stillness of that emptying. Not frightening, not loud, just the hush of a place growing quiet, like a candle slowly losing its flame. Part of a pattern we've begun to see, places left behind, meals unfinished, mornings that never happened. A soft mystery unfolding with every chapter of this night. As the population drifted downward from hundreds to mere dozens, the village seemed to exhale a long, tired breath. Houses that once held conversations, laughter, and the soft clatter of cutlery at dinner now stood silent, their windows catching only the reflection of passing clouds. The roads, once dusty from the footsteps of children running to school, hardened into still paths where no footsteps sounded anymore. In many mysterious disappearance cases, there is a moment, a turning point, where something changes sharply. But here there was no single moment. The village simply dimmed, like a lantern whose oil ran out, drop by quiet drop. Investigators who later studied the abandoned village mystery pointed to the census records, the only timeline that remained. 1 year, population 847, then 790, then 642, then 511, then 301, then 198, then a chilling simple note, population 0. No explanation, no lines in the margins, no mention of where people went. The records looked less like official documents and more like someone slowly erasing a drawing, piece by piece, until nothing was left but blank paper. And yet, strangely, there was no sense of danger attached to this fading away. Residents who left never spoke of fear. They simply relocated, drifted outward, took new jobs, followed relatives, or moved to towns with bigger schools. Every departure sounded logical on its own. It was only when seen in hindsight as a pattern that the emptiness felt impossible to explain. Before the last families departed, a curious atmosphere settled over the village. Shops closed earlier. The school kept its doors open even when only 5 children attended. The church bell rang more softly, as though echo itself had grown weary. Some evenings a faint wind would whistle through the alleyways, and the sound carried a strange illusion, like distant voices that no longer belonged to anyone. An elderly man, one of the last residents, told visiting researchers years later that the silence felt like it was watching us pack. Another said she would hear knocking sounds late at night, not frightening, just persistent, like reminders of people who used to live next door. As more homes were abandoned, everyday objects remained behind. A bicycle leaning against a stone wall, its tires slowly deflating, a pair of gardening gloves left on a bench, a half-finished quilt frozen forever in its frame, and toys scattered on a lawn where no child had played in months. These small traces of life left without their owners created a strange tenderness more than fear. It was as if the village missed its people. Travelers passing through wondered why no one tried to repopulate the place. The fertile soil remained. The wells still produced clear water. The houses were sturdy, beautiful in their quiet way. But whenever someone thought of staying, they described an inexplicable reluctance. Not dread, just a soft heaviness, as if the air itself whispered, "This place is already in its ending." Some scholars compared the village to a long-forgotten melody, one that fades not because it is dissonant, but because it naturally reaches its final note. Others suggested that the disappearance of an entire community could not be attributed solely to economics or migration. Instead, they theorized a psychological chain reaction. When too many families left, the remaining ones simply couldn't hold the weight of normalcy. Slowly, gently, they too slipped away. Much later, investigators mapping the region pointed out that the village sat directly along the same inland path that an explorer, our Chapter 6 mystery, would travel before walking into the fog and never returning. A coincidence, perhaps, but in this series of sleep stories, patterns matter. Places left behind, routines unfinished, roads that lead into silence. And underneath all of these mysteries, a rumor from the elders lingered that many years before they had read about a ghost ship found drifting at sea with no crew aboard, a ship abandoned quietly, just as their homes would one day be. As dusk fell over the emptying village, the sky took on muted purples and soft gray-blue tones. Doors swung gently in the evening breeze. The schoolyard gates rested half open. The church, though locked, felt hollow inside, its echo lingering without any footsteps to carry it. It was not a tragic place, only a place paused at the edge of being forgotten. Tonight, as you drift deeper into rest, imagine walking through this village in twilight. The quiet is not eerie, it is soft, a quiet that wraps around you like a blanket, a place where time decided to linger even after people stopped doing the same. By the time the last dozen residents prepared to leave, the village had already begun to feel more like a memory than a place. It was not abandoned in anger, nor in fear, nor in sudden tragedy. Instead, it drifted gently out of existence, the way a long-forgotten dream slips out of the mind, quietly, without protest, without a single moment to mark its ending. The remaining families packed slowly, as though they sensed the village wanted time to absorb their departure. One woman lingered in her kitchen long after the last box was taped shut, running her fingers along the counter where she once taught her children to knead dough. Another man walked one final loop around the small central square, stopping briefly at the empty bench where he used to read the newspaper while the church bell rang behind him.
There was no ceremony, no farewell gathering. The village simply watched its people leave with the same soft silence that had grown over it for years. When the final resident locked his door, though some would say he didn't lock it at all, continuing the motif of unlocked places that echo throughout our unsolved disappearances, the sound was faint, almost swallowed by the wind. He placed the key beneath a stone at the doorstep, not for anyone in particular, but because leaving it felt gentler than taking it away. And after he stepped onto the inland road, the one that would one day guide an explorer toward his last known footsteps before entering the fog, the village was alone, not destroyed, not ruined, just uninhabited. A population zero town with walls still standing and memories quietly stitched into every stone. Seasons passed. In spring, wildflowers grew along the fence lines of empty homes, weaving colors into the quiet like nature's patient embroidery. In summer, sunlight pooled through open windows, warming floors that no one walked on. Autumn winds carried leaves across rooftops as if sweeping the village gently toward forgetfulness. And in winter, snow softened every sharp edge, turning the empty settlement into something almost sacred, an untouched sleep story written in frost. Researchers who came years later reported a strange sense of calm upon entering the abandoned village. One of them wrote, "It felt like the buildings had been waiting for us, not for answers, but simply for company." Another described the silence as the kind you don't want to break, the kind that makes you breathe quieter without meaning to. They documented household items exactly where they had been left: a kettle on a stove, a coat draped neatly over a chair, a school notebook open to a half-finished sentence. All of it suggested that life here had paused rather than ended. And this gentle pause echoes through other mysteries of this night: unfinished meals on a silent ship, an uneaten breakfast in a vanished family's home, a train seat soon to be left empty, and the faint trail of footprints that will later appear in the snow. A pattern is forming beneath the surface, not sinister, but strangely tender, as if these disappearances were stories that slipped out of the world instead of being torn from it. The villagers' final traces also revealed something unexpected. In one abandoned house, investigators found a children's drawing taped to the door. It showed a map of the village, not entirely accurate, not entirely wrong, just the way a child might imagine home. But something about it was uncanny. Every building was drawn, but none of the people. Whether it meant anything, no one could say. Perhaps the child simply forgot to add figures, or perhaps the drawing, innocent as it was, reflected the quiet truth of a place destined to empty itself. As the years stretched on, grass grew over walkways, vines curled around chimneys, and the village slowly surrendered to time. Yet its story, soft, slow, and strangely peaceful, became one of the most notable abandoned village mysteries ever recorded. Not because of danger, but because of quietness. Because it showed that not all disappearances arrive like storms. Some arrive like dusk, gradually, gently, folding the world into shadow, one window at a time. Tonight, as we close this chapter, imagine yourself standing in the village at sunset, the air cool, the silence delicate, the sky tinged with fading lavender. Nothing frightening here, only a stillness that invites rest. And when you're ready, we'll step toward the next mystery, where a passenger boards a train, sits in his seat, and never reaches his stop.
Ticket checked, seat found, luggage above his head. When the train doors opened, his suitcase rolled out. He didn't. Tonight, we move from abandoned villages and silent homes into what many historians quietly refer to as transportation mystery number 1 of this night. A calm, well-documented case where a missing train passenger simply ceased to be somewhere between two ordinary stations. No panic, no alarms, no signs of struggle, just a disappearance that folded neatly into the rhythm of the rails. The passenger boarded the late evening train on a mild spring night. Witnesses remembered him because he looked so ordinary, someone you would never look at twice. He wore a dark coat, carried a modest suitcase, and nodded politely at the conductor when his ticket was checked. Nothing strange, nothing out of place. And yet, by the time the train arrived at his stop, the man was gone, and the suitcase that should have belonged to him rolled gently onto the platform as though nudged by an invisible hand. The conductor noted something curious during later interviews. The door of the passenger's train car had remained unlocked the entire journey. Not forced open, not rattled by wind or impact, just unlocked. A detail that softly echoes the unlocked front door of the vanished family and the unlatched homes of the emptying village. A motif forming in the quiet dark of this night. Doors that open peacefully, without fear, without signs of struggle, as if the world itself leaves them ajar for whoever slips through. The train route passed through countryside that, just a few miles away, touched the deserted outskirts of the abandoned village from Chapter 3. The conductor remembered that as the train curved through that silent region, the night sky seemed unusually clear, the fields unusually still, and the lights of the empty homes flickered faintly in the distance like faint memories. It was the kind of landscape that made people fall quiet without knowing why. Fellow passengers later recalled the man settling comfortably into his seat, placing his suitcase neatly above his head, and gazing out the window as the sun finished setting. The light dimmed, the rhythm of the wheels softened, and soon the train car grew peaceful. A perfect environment for a sleep story. Steady motion, low hum, darkness gently folding around the compartments. No one saw him stand. No one saw him move. No one noticed him walk down the aisle or step into another car. Some believed he must have slipped off at one of the smaller stops along the way, but security footage showed no trace of him. Others thought he might have opened the door mid-journey, but there was no wind disturbance, no sudden pressure change, no sound. The sensors detecting the doors never displayed any anomaly. It was as if the man simply dissolved into the space between one station and the next. What made the case even calmer and strangely more haunting was the absence of urgency. There were no screams, no commotion, no overturned items. His book remained neatly tucked in the seat pocket, his coat folded on the armrest, as though he had stepped away for just a moment. His water bottle was half full, untouched. Everything around him suggested temporary absence, not disappearance. When investigators studied the suitcase, they found nothing unusual. Clothes packed carefully, toiletries arranged neatly, a notebook filled with business-style handwriting, and a train ticket for a meeting scheduled the next morning, a meeting he never arrived for. That morning, as railway officers walked the length of the tracks, they found no footprints on the gravel, no disturbed soil, no pieces of fabric caught on branches. The quiet earth held no memory of him. One officer wrote in the report, "It feels less like he left the train and more like the world gently misplaced him." And in the years that followed, something even stranger emerged. The location of the train's final stretch overlapped the lower edge of the air corridor where, many years later, a passenger plane would vanish from radar and never reach its destination, a calm foreshadowing of Chapter 7. The railway case, the plane case, the ship case, they form a soft constellation of unsolved disappearances connected not by violence, but by silence. Tonight, as this chapter begins, we step gently into another quiet enigma. A train in motion, a seat left warm, a suitcase rolling out into the dawn, and a man who was seen, remembered, documented, yet somehow never arrived.
In the days that followed the strange disappearance, railway investigators walked the length of the train car again and again, searching for anything: a wrinkle in the upholstery, a strand of fabric, a dent, a misplaced object that might suggest the missing passenger had moved, struggled, or attempted to leave. But the car felt untouched, almost reverent in its stillness, like a room holding its breath. The seat he occupied remained perfectly shaped, a faint warmth still lingering in the fabric when officers first arrived, as though the memory of a person had not yet fully faded. His book marked with a folded page, his coat resting on the armrest, his water bottle exactly half full, all remained as gentle reminders that he intended to continue his journey. The items felt less like evidence and more like witnesses, quiet, undisturbed, loyal to the story of a man who meant to sit back down. The train itself had made no sudden stops, no jolt, no emergency brake. Passengers recalled the ride as unremarkably smooth, the kind that lulled people into naps. A mother traveling 2 rows behind the man said she remembered closing her eyes as the train passed the darkened edge of the abandoned village from Chapter 3. It was so quiet outside, she told investigators, as if the fields were listening. Another passenger recalled looking up at one point and noticing that the man's seat was empty, but she thought nothing of it, assuming he had gone to the restroom. The restroom, however, was empty when investigators checked it later. No sign he had ever opened the door. One detail puzzled railway engineers. Sensors on the train recorded every door event: doors opening, closing, locking, unlocking. On that journey, no anomalies appeared. No door was opened between stops. And yet, when the train slowed into the man's destination, the door at his end of the car slid open smoothly, unlocked, unjammed, unforced. It was as normal and ordinary as an evening breeze. The unlocked door echoed the motif of this night: the family's front door in Chapter 2, the open houses in the abandoned village in Chapter 3, and later, another door, a cabin hatch, will appear again in the silent altitudes of Chapter 7. Patterns, subtle and soft, connecting lives that should never have touched one another. Investigators traced the passenger's background with the same patience they used inside the car.
He had checked into his hotel earlier that afternoon, spoke politely to the receptionist, made a dinner reservation he never canceled. He bought a ticket return for the next morning's business meeting at a nearby city. His colleagues described him as organized, reliable, and calm. No debts, no conflicts, no health concerns. Nothing to suggest he wanted to disappear. Nothing to imply he feared anything. If anything, he seemed like a man mid-routine, someone in the middle of life rather than stepping away from it. That made his absence feel even more impossible. On the third day of the investigation, officers walked the tracks again, focusing on the stretch near the small station close to the emptying village. The gravel remained undisturbed. The metal rails showed no unusual marks. Even the grass growing near the fence line seemed untouched. A soft breeze pushed through the reeds, but the land itself held no memory of a lost traveler. One officer noted, "It feels like the night swallowed a moment, not a man." And train operators, reviewing black box logs, confirmed something eerie. Between two specific timestamps, the train experienced an unusual stillness. The vibrations dropped slightly, not enough to be alarming, just enough to be noticeable. A dip so gentle it would not wake a sleeping passenger. It lasted for 27 seconds. Afterward, everything returned to normal. That 27-second hush later became the center of endless speculation. Some believed the passenger slipped off during that liminal quiet. Others said he stepped into another car. Others suggested he simply vanished in the same way the village had emptied, softly, slowly, quietly. But no theory ever fit cleanly. Years later, when journalists revisited the case for a calm mystery narration segment, a conductor mentioned something he had never written in his report. As the train approached the man's stop that night, a reflection flickered, just briefly, in the window across from the empty seat. He described it as a shape like someone standing on the platform already, though no one had been there when the doors opened. He couldn't explain it, and he eventually dismissed it as fatigue. Still, the detail remained in his memory, a faint echo of presence where there should have been absence. Tonight, as we continue, imagine the gentle sway of the train car, the soft hum against the tracks, and the quiet realization that some stories don't leave ripples. They leave stillness. A man with a ticket, a seat still warm, a suitcase that arrives without its owner, and a journey that continues without the one who began it.
When the official investigation closed, the file contained fewer than 20 pages. No conclusions, no suspects, no explanations. Just a record of a man who boarded a train, sat quietly, and never reached his stop. Time passed. The seats in that car were replaced, the old train retired, the railway modernized. Yet, conductors still whispered the story when night journeys grew long and silence settled in the aisles. There was once a passenger, they would say softly, whose suitcase arrived, but he did not. And then the train's motion would fill the space between words, steady, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. Some said the mystery belonged to the archives now, a forgotten case fading into dust. But every few years, something small would bring it back. A letter found in an attic,
a retired worker recalling the sound of that night, or a traveler claiming to have seen an empty seat reflected in the window beside them, even though the car was full. None of these were confirmations, only echoes, faint as breath on glass. The missing train passenger became a kind of myth told in quiet tones, not frightening, but strangely soothing. Perhaps because there was no violence in it, no sharp ending, just a soft vanishing, folded neatly into the schedule of the world. The train route itself remained. Each evening, new travelers boarded, unaware they were following the same tracks. Between two small towns, the line curved gently past the fields near the abandoned village, a place where wind slipped through hollow windows and grass grew where voices once were. Those who looked out sometimes reported a flicker of light in the distance, as though a lantern were being carried along the old path beside the tracks. It would vanish as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind only stillness. Some nights, drivers said, the signals along that section blinked once without reason, never red, never warning, just a brief pulse of acknowledgement, like the railway itself remembered. No one ever proved anything supernatural. The company logs marked each anomaly as electrical interference. But for those who believed in quieter possibilities, the story stayed alive, not as a ghost tale, but as a meditation on absence. Where do people go when the world forgets to notice them leaving? When the ordinary folds into the impossible, not with thunder, but with grace. As years stretched into decades, the passenger's name blurred into legend. But one detail never changed: the unlocked door. Investigators, historians, and storytellers alike noted that the mechanism was fully functional, the lock undamaged, the signal light still green. The door was open, yes, but only slightly, as if waiting. That same phrase appeared again and again in their reports. The door was open, a detail simple enough to ignore, but impossible to forget. One writer later called it a door between worlds, hidden in plain sight. And perhaps that's what makes these calm mysteries linger. The quiet suggestion that disappearance is not destruction, but transition. That there are places one can go where the body leaves no trace, but the warmth of its presence still lingers in the fabric of a seat, in the quiet hum of rails, in the memory of those who stayed behind. Decades later, as the railway introduced new high-speed trains, one journalist took the same route for a commemorative article. She sat near where the man's seat would have been and described the experience in one sentence. It felt like traveling beside an empty heartbeat. That line closed her piece, but it could have closed the entire case. Tonight, as we drift away from this chapter, Let the image settle softly. A train in motion, doors gently sliding, the rhythmic breath of iron and wind. Somewhere between departure and arrival, something or someone stepped quietly out of the ordinary. And as we leave this station behind, we glance ahead toward the cold horizon of the next story, where snow will fall and children will walk a winter road that leads only into silence. Small boots in fresh snow, tiny laughs in the cold evening air, and then only wind and a line of footprints that simply stopped. This case is often described as one of the most heartbreaking disappearances in history. Yet tonight, we approach it gently, like cupping a fragile memory in warm hands. No fear, no urgency, only quiet reflection as we walk alongside a moment frozen in time. The story begins in a rural corner of the world where winters were long, where the sun sank early behind the fields, and where the silence after snowfall felt as soft as a blanket. It was a place not far from the railway line we followed in the previous chapter, a region where the roads curled through farmland and small woods before eventually reaching the foothills that would matter later, farther in our journey tonight. On this winter evening, the children, siblings, close in age, were simply walking home. Their school was small, their route familiar, and though the sky darkened fast in that season, people in the area were used to letting children wander home together. It had always been safe, always quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and where even the stillness of snow felt reassuring rather than cold. The weather that day was typical of the region. Gentle flakes falling in slow spirals, air crisp enough to make breath visible, wind moving through the hedges in soft sighs. But just like in the chapter of the explorer who would someday walk into a fog, and just like in the final case high in the mountains, this was the kind of weather that hid distance, blurred shapes, and softened sound. A landscape that looked peaceful, but could swallow footsteps faster than the world could record them. Witnesses said the children were cheerful when they left school. Their teacher recalled their scarves trailing behind them as they waved goodbye. A farmer tending to his animals saw them crossing a small wooden bridge, their boots tapping lightly, their laughter drifting like bells carried by the wind. They were seen again by an elderly woman who lived near the edge of the fields. She said they were holding hands, one child pointing at something in the sky, a bird perhaps, or a drifting snowflake that caught the fading light. And then, nothing. Not a scream, not a sign of struggle, not even a broken branch or a dropped mitten. Only a line of footprints continuing forward until, shockingly, they did not. The prints simply ended. Investigators later described it in measured tones. Footsteps terminate abruptly. But people from the village had their own way of putting it. They walked as children do, and then they walked no more. Snow can play strange tricks, of course. Wind can fill prints, fresh snowfall can erase the past, but on that evening, the weather shifted in an unusual way. Calm to restless, clear to hazy, mirroring the strange patterns seen later in the fog described in the Explorer's chapter. The kind of weather where the world itself feels as though it is in transition, not fully here, not fully elsewhere. The search began quickly, but without panic. At first, neighbors assumed the children had taken shelter with a family friend, but as lanterns were lit and doors opened to the cold, a quiet unease began to settle over the fields. Not fear, not yet, just a sense that something that should have been simple was suddenly not. The footprints remained the only clue, a faint path leading across the open snow. They traced a gentle arc across the white surface, then softened, then faded, and then vanished entirely, as though the winter road had exhaled and taken them back. Tonight, as we begin this chapter, imagine walking that same path, but slowly, peacefully, unafraid. The snow cushions each step. The air is cool but gentle against your skin. The wind moves softly, never sharply. We follow the trail not to uncover pain, but to listen, to the silence, to the stillness, to what remains when a moment slips out of the world without leaving an answer. And later tonight, high in the mountains in another storm of snow, we will remember these footprints. For snow and silence have a way of returning, circling gently through the stories of disappearances like a quiet refrain.
As the search continued into the deeper hours of that winter evening, lanterns flickered across the fields like small floating stars. Volunteers moved slowly, not wanting to disturb the snow, as if the quiet of the landscape itself was guiding them toward a truth no one could quite grasp. Their footsteps were gentle, their breaths steady, and the only sound that joined them was the low hum of wind weaving through empty branches. In quiet places like this, sound travels differently. It stretches out, softens, and blends into the world like a long exhale. The searchers called the children's names, but their voices seemed to drift upward instead of forward, disappearing into the pale dusk that settled over the land. Some said that the snow didn't feel threatening that evening. It felt almost protective, like a blanket trying to preserve something delicate rather than conceal it. The footprints remained the only guide, but they were fading faster with every passing minute. A few prints were still sharp, tiny ovals pressed into the powdery surface, while others were blurred by wind that brushed across the fields in quiet sweeps. One set of prints angled slightly toward a narrow path leading between two bare trees. Another set wandered near a fence line as though one child had paused, maybe to look at something or simply to tug up a falling mitten. These small deviations painted a portrait of innocence, children moving in their own rhythm, unaware that their final steps would become a mystery whispered for generations. As the searchers followed the trail, they noticed the same eerie shift in weather that had marked the night the explorer in Chapter 6 would someday vanish into the fog. The temperature dropped, the air thickened, and shadows stretched strangely across the snow, even though the moon had not yet appeared. A kind of hushed stillness settled across the land, as though the world were listening rather than speaking. And then the footprints ended. Not near a riverbank, not beside an animal track, not at a road or a cliff or a frozen lake. They simply stopped at a patch of open snow where there was nothing around. No depression, no hole, no sign that the children had changed direction or been carried away. Just a sudden absence, as if the snow itself had drawn a curtain. Searchers stood in a circle around a last visible print, unsure of what they were seeing. One man, a lifelong resident of the region, whispered that he had once read about a ship found drifting at sea, a vessel with warm coffee left untouched, and crew members who had simply vanished. The others nodded. Stories have a way of lingering in such places. The search expanded in all directions, growing wider and more desperate in shape, but never in tone. No shouting, no frantic rush, just a quiet, steady sweep across pastures, groves, and frozen ditches. Dogs were brought in, but their noses lifted again and again in confusion, as if the scent had dissolved into the winter air. Hours passed. The snow deepened. The frost thickened on lantern glass, and slowly the searchers realized they were chasing a moment that had already slipped through their hands. Reports later described the scene with unfeeling precision. Location rural. Weather diminishing visibility. Last known movement consistent with walking. Termination point unclear. But those who lived through the night remembered something different, a sense of gentleness, of quiet sadness, not danger. A feeling that the world had shifted slightly, like a page turning in a book without anyone touching it. As we drift through this chapter tonight, imagine the landscape not as a scene of loss, but a memory suspended in time, a moment preserved, not erased. A winter road stretching peacefully before us, leading to a place where sound fades, breath softens, and footprints melt into the story we carry with us. And just as this winter night folds itself into silence, snow will return once more later tonight, on a mountain, under a harsher sky, where the last chapter waits with its final lonely footprints.
Night settled fully over the countryside as the search reached its quietest hour. That in-between moment when evening has faded, but true darkness has not yet taken hold. Lanterns glowed like warm orbs scattered across the snow, their light forming gentle halos that made every movement feel softer, slower, almost dreamlike. Even the searchers themselves began to move with the kind of stillness one finds only in winter landscapes. Careful steps, measured breaths, glances shared in silence rather than questions spoken aloud. No one wished to break the calm, for the night felt delicate, as though sound itself might shatter it. As they expanded the search toward the edge of the woods, a faint fog began to roll in, drifting low across the fields in long silver ribbons. It was the same kind of fog that would one day swallow the explorer in Chapter 6, the same weather that blurred the horizon and made familiar shapes appear dreamlike. Some of the volunteers paused to watch it settle, not out of fear, but out of a quiet recognition that nature sometimes folds the world inward, hiding its details beneath breath-like veils. In that moment, one of the older villagers spoke softly, sharing a memory from his youth. He told the others that long ago he had read about a drifting ship found far out at sea, a vessel where dinner sat untouched and coffee remained warm. Yet no one aboard had been found. The other searchers listened, not because the story offered answers, but because in places like this, stories connect people more deeply than explanations ever could. And though none of them said it aloud, they all felt a strange thread weaving through the night, a link between the silent ship on the ocean, the family whose door had been left unlocked, the quiet village that had emptied, and now these small missing children on a winter road. A pattern not of danger, but of absence, of lives interrupted mid-motion, like lantern flames flickering while the world turns without warning. As the searchers reached the forest line, the snow deepened. Branches bowed slightly under the weight of fresh flakes. The fog drifted between trunks like pale scarves. Dogs padded forward, ears flicking, noses lowered, but again they paused, confused. They turned in small circles, then lifted their heads to the air as though the trail had risen into the sky. The villagers understood this silence. It was the same kind of quiet that came before large storms or after long nights. A silence that swallowed distances, softened the ground, and made the night feel endless. They did not rush, they did not despair. They simply kept moving, lanterns swaying gently in their gloved hands. Eventually, someone suggested resting for a moment beside a small stone wall half buried under drifting snow. The searchers gathered there, forming a loose semicircle. Some removed their gloves to warm their hands by lantern heat. Others brushed snow from their coats or leaned back against the stones, feeling the cold through thick winter fabric. It was in this quiet pause that the realization settled among them, not sharply, not suddenly, but as softly as snowflakes landing on wool. They understood that the search would continue into morning, but the answer might remain beyond reach, not because of danger or malice or something lurking in the night, but because some stories slip from the world without leaving a trail that human eyes can follow. And winter has a way of closing its doors softly. When dawn finally approached, pale and slow, the fields shimmered under a thin veil of frost. The footprints from the previous day were nearly invisible, their shapes smoothed into faint shadows beneath ice crystals. The villagers looked at the land with quiet acceptance. They could feel that the night had taken something with it, something tender. Yet the world around them remains gentle. No violence, no chaos, only a lingering stillness that seemed to whisper that some mysteries do not break the world, they simply fold into it. Reports later mentioned the case in plain, emotionless lines, but those who lived through that night recalled warmth, not terror. They remembered the way lanterns glowed in the snow, the way breath curled like smoke in the cold air, the way the world felt paused, as if waiting for something neither good nor bad, just inevitable. Tonight, as we conclude this chapter in our sleep story, imagine stepping back from the winter fields with the searchers, letting the cold fade from your fingers as lantern light flickers gently behind you. Ahead lies a new path, fog-laden, mysterious, yet calm. The same path an explorer will someday take as he walks into the mist of Chapter 6. And just like him, and just like the children whose footsteps faded into snow, we follow quietly, letting the story lead us into the softest corners of the night. He wrote, "If the weather clears tomorrow, we will finally see the coast." Tomorrow came, the fog thickened, and history lost his trail. Tonight, we return to one of the region's most quietly haunting lost explorer mysteries, a disappearance not marked by panic or violence, but by a soft curtain of fog that drifted across the landscape like a living breath. This explorer was not a reckless adventurer chasing glory. He was meticulous, steady, the kind of man who measured his steps and documented every detail with calm discipline. His journals were filled with careful lines, dated notes, descriptions of trees, rock formations, rivers, and the moods of the sky. He wasn't lost, not at first. He knew where he was going, knew the direction, knew the terrain better than many who came after him. Yet the world has a way of reshaping itself under fog,
turning familiar paths into thresholds where certainty dissolves. His planned route stretched across a region that decades earlier held a small village, the same one from Chapter 3, the town that slowly emptied until its population fell from 847 to 0. The explorer knew the place existed once. His notes even mentioned a settlement abandoned long before my arrival, a place where houses still stood, but windows stared out like blank eyes. He passed near that land on his way northward, following a ridge that offered glimpses of valleys now swallowed by silence. But that silence didn't frighten him. It intrigued him. He believed nature held stories, and he wanted to walk through them quietly, like a respectful guest. On the night before he vanished, he wrote the line we began with, an optimistic hope that tomorrow's weather would clear, giving him a full view of the coastline he had followed for weeks. He described the fog as thin and temporary, rolling in from the lowlands near the river. He had no reason to be concerned. The fog of that region was known to drift at night and lift in the morning. But the fog that met him the next day was different, thicker, colder, heavier, like a curtain soaked in ice. Other travelers later described that same type of fog as a moving wall, something that swallowed landmarks even from a few feet away. The morning he walked into it, visibility dropped so drastically that his compass was the only anchor he had. But even compasses feel different when the world around you fades into blankness, when sound becomes muffled, when the ground loses its texture, when every direction looks the same. His last recorded coordinates were written with a steady hand, but those numbers would later be underlined in an aviation report concerning a plane that never reached its destination. An echo, a strange future connection, a reminder that certain places seem to borrow people from the world without returning them. It was the fog, not fear, that unsettled the searchers who later tried to trace his path. They described it as cold enough to silence breath, a fog so dense it blurred shapes even up close. People spoke of hearing distant drips of melting frost, yet seeing nothing but white. The forest around him shifted into a dreamlike state, where trees became ghostly silhouettes, and the air felt as though it carried a quiet weight. His footprints were found for a while, a steady, confident trail heading toward a sloping hill. Investigators noted how even, how calm, how consistent his gait was. He didn't run, he didn't stumble, he moved with purpose, as though he believed the path ahead was safe. And in a way, it was. There were no signs of predators, no cliffs, no hidden crevices, nothing dangerous, just fog. A landscape paused beneath a veil of white, waiting silently for him to step deeper into it. As we begin this chapter of our gentle nighttime story, imagine walking beside him, not to solve anything, but to feel the quiet world he stepped into. The ground is soft beneath your boots. The air is cool, not harsh. Each breath leaves a small cloud that drifts upward and dissolves. The fog curls around trees, not ominous, but soft, like mist rising from a warm cup. There is no alarm in this disappearance, no violence, only a slow fade, like someone stepping from one room into another, leaving the door open behind them. Tonight, we follow his path at that same gentle pace, letting the fog fold around us as softly as the night itself.
The search for the explorer began quietly. just as the fog had settled quietly over the valley. The men who set out after him were locals, farmers, woodsmen, people who knew the land not through maps, but through years of walking it with their own feet. They understood the shape of every hill, the bend of every stream, the way sound traveled between trees. And they all agreed on one thing. The world had been strange that morning, not frightening, only unusual in its stillness. They said the fog had a weight to it, a texture almost like wool, soft yet thick enough that distant shapes melted before the eyes could grasp them. When they reached the place where the explorer had camped the night before, everything was exactly as it should have been. His bedroll was dry, his fire circle was neatly arranged, his journal lay open to the page he had written last, the ink dried calmly, the handwriting steady. There were no signs of haste, no overturned objects, no indication that he had felt threatened or even disturbed. The only unusual detail was the silence, the kind that does not simply fill a space, but seems to hold it in place. The searchers called his name, but the fog absorbed their voices almost immediately, swallowing sound the way snow swallowed footprints in the previous chapter. The forest around them felt suspended in time, as though waiting for something to happen, but unwilling to move first. They followed his footprints as far as they could. At first they were clear, distinct impressions in the damp soil where the fog had collected as droplets. The prints suggested a calm, steady pace, no hesitation, no wandering. But as the fog thickened, the ground softened, and the footprints gradually blurred. One print dissolved at the edge of a small stream, another faded into pine needles beneath an old tree stump. The path became less a trail and more a suggestion, a series of gentle hints pointing toward the ridge he had planned to climb. One of the searchers, an older man with a memory long enough to trace stories back through decades, paused and whispered that this ridge overlooked the abandoned village from long ago, the same village from Chapter 3, whose houses stood hollow and whose church bell had not rung in generations. The others nodded silently, not because the detail changed anything, but because patterns have a way of settling into the mind during long searches like this. When the group reached the lower slopes of the ridge, the fog thickened even further, curling around the rocks and trees as though it were choosing what to reveal and what to hide. The searchers lit lanterns, but the light barely penetrated more than a few feet. The world felt folded, its edges tucked inward. It was here, on this slope, that the footprints ended, not abruptly like the children's trail in the snow, but gradually, slowly fading until the impressions flattened into nothing. One of the men touched the earth where the last hint of a print remained. The soil was cool, damp, and undisturbed. No marks of struggle, no signs of another person, no shift in the dirt that would suggest he had fallen. Just a place where a step had once been, softened into the land as though the world had gently taken it back. They searched for hours, moving carefully so as not to disturb the fog that floated around them like a living presence. At one point, a breeze stirred the mist, lifting it in thin veils. For a moment, the searchers could see the outline of the ridge above them, the same ridge where the explorer might have stood had the fog lifted that morning. Then the breeze faded, and the world went white again. Reports later recorded the disappearance in measured language, quote, "Last known location, approximately 2 kilometers east of the abandoned valley. Visibility minimal. Terrain stable. Conclusion undetermined." But the searchers remembered something different, something quieter. They remembered the way the fog moved, the way it thinned just enough to hint at a horizon, and then thickened as though protecting the land. They remembered how time seemed to slow, how footsteps seemed softer, how the world felt as though it were holding its breath. And all of them, though they never said it out loud, carried the same impression. The explorer had not run, or fallen, or been taken. He had simply continued walking into a place where fog blurred the boundary between the seen and the unseen. Tonight, as we linger in this soft, white space, imagine following his path, not searching for answers, but letting the mist gather gently around your shoulders. This is not a story of fear. It is a story of silence, of patience, of a man who stepped forward, trusting the world around him even when it disappeared into pale, drifting fog. And soon, as night deepens, this fog will echo again, high above the earth, where a pilot will fly into a sky that never returns his plane to the runway waiting for it.
As the day slowly surrendered to evening, the searchers realized they were moving not just through the forest, but through a silence that seemed to deepen with every hour. The fog wrapped itself around tree trunks, draped across fallen branches, and pooled in hollows like a pale, living presence. It wasn't cold enough to sting, but it carried a coolness that settled gently on their clothes, soft as breath on glass. The search had stretched long beyond what they expected, yet no one spoke of stopping. They continued their slow, deliberate movements, lanterns swinging in small arcs that carved warm circles into the whiteness around them. Every few steps, someone would pause, listening, not for danger, but for any subtle change in the texture of the silence. In fog like this, sound arrived strangely. Footsteps echoed as though coming from below. Distant drips of water seemed closer than they were. Even the rustle of wind overhead felt muted, as if each sound had been wrapped carefully before being released. Near the upper ridge, where the land tilted gently upward, the searchers found another trace. Not a footprint this time, but a small tuft of moss brushed aside in a way that suggested someone had steadied themselves while walking. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a clue that demanded anything. It was simply a sign that the explorer had continued forward with the same calm intention he had shown from the beginning. They followed the slope, but within minutes the fog thickened further, as though the world itself had taken a deep inhale. The light from their lanterns seemed to shrink, drawn inward until only faint halos marked where each man stood. The ridge above was no longer visible, nor the valley below. It felt like standing inside a cloud with no sky above it. And then the fog shifted, not dramatically, just a subtle pull like fabric being lifted. The searchers saw for a brief moment the faint lines of a higher path curving along the ridge. A few stepped forward, but the moment dissolved as quickly as it came, the world folding in again with a gentle whisper.
Some later wondered whether the explorer might have seen that same path, whether the fog had parted for him just long enough to invite him forward. Not with danger, not with fear, but with the quiet promise of something worth discovering. The searchers rested at the ridge's lower edge, knowing the light was fading, but feeling no urgency, as if the land itself encouraged patience. Someone mentioned the explorer's last written coordinates and how they pointed toward a natural fault line, a place where compass readings could become unreliable. Another man commented that the same coordinates would later reappear in a strange aviation report, underlined for reasons no one fully understood. Yet no one proposed explanations. Explanations felt too sharp for a night like this, too loud. Instead, they let the fog settle around them, lanterns flickering like small stars anchored in the white. The disappearance was not spoken of as tragedy, but as something softer, a moment absorbed into landscape rather than stolen by it. When the search finally ended at sunrise the next day, the world revealed itself slowly, like a painting washed with pale gold. The fog thinned in layers, drifting upward into the morning sky. Trees regained their shapes, stones regained their shadows, and yet the explorer's trail did not return with the light. The land looked peaceful, untouched, whole, as though nothing had ever been out of place. The official report concluded simply, "Path lost in fog." But those who had walked the slope understood something deeper, that sometimes a journey continues into spaces where human steps cannot follow, places where fog becomes a quiet threshold. Tonight, as we close this chapter, imagine yourself standing at the edge of that ridge at dawn. The air is cool, the world is pale and soft. The last threads of fog lift like slow drifting curtains, and above you, the sky opens. Not sharply, but gently, a soft expanse that feels endless. It is in that sky, in that pale morning silence, that the next mystery waits. Because many years after the explorer disappeared into fog on the ground, another traveler, this time in the air, would fly into a blanket of clouds just as thick, just as dreamlike, and never emerge again. And so we lift our eyes now toward that quiet sky, where a plane once traced its final path. The last radio message said, "Everything looks normal." Minutes later, the plane was no longer on radar or anywhere at all. Tonight, we drift upward into the quietest aviation disappearance case of the century, aviation mystery number 1 of our journey. No flames, no distress call, no turbulence strong enough to shake a voice. Just a simple, calm message spoken by a pilot who had flown this exact route dozens of times. And then, silence. The plane was small, built for short regional flights, the kind that carried workers, students, families, and a few travelers who liked the convenience of skipping long roads. Its planned path crossed over the same stretch of sea where the ghost ship of Chapter 1 had been discovered long ago, drifting softly, dinner untouched, crew gone without alarm. And later, the plane would pass close to the coordinates recorded by the explorer from Chapter 6, the last place his careful handwriting left a mark before fog accepted him into its white folds. The pilot knew the region well. He understood the coastline, the weather patterns, the way clouds tended to gather over the water and roll slowly inland. That evening, forecasts mentioned thick clouds, but nothing severe. Passengers boarded with scarves, jackets, and the soft murmur of people settling into their seats at the end of a long day. Some closed their eyes. Others watched the lights on the runway blur slightly in the mist. Nothing unusual, nothing foreboding. As the plane ascended, it slipped into layers of cloud, soft, dense, gentle. The world outside faded to gray. The hum of the engine steadied into a lullaby-like vibration. Flight attendants moved quietly, checking bags, offering water, tucking blankets over children who had already fallen asleep. The sky that night was not violent. It was not dramatic. It was simply heavy with cloud, a ceiling of white and silver that absorbed sound and narrowed the horizon. On the cockpit recorder, the pilot's voice was calm, visibility low, instruments steady, then a pause. Everything looks normal. That was the final sentence anyone ever heard. Minutes later, radar screens showed the plane's signal flicker, weaken, and then dissolve completely, as though the sky had exhaled and erased it. There was no sign of rapid descent, no sudden drop, no change in speed or altitude. The signal simply stopped. Search teams mobilized quickly, but with the same quiet diligence seen in every chapter thus far. Boats scanned the coastline. Aircraft traced slow circles over the sea. Teams on the ground looked toward the mountains, mindful that the pilot's last known heading passed near the ridge where the explorer had disappeared into fog decades earlier. But the sky offered no clues, no debris, no sound, no light. Only wind moving across clouds that seemed thicker the higher the searchers climbed. Witnesses along the coast later reported something unusual, not loud, but memorable. They described the clouds as brighter than normal, almost glowing from within, as though the sky held a lantern behind its dense curtain. Others said the wind carried a hum, not mechanical, just a soft resonance, like air passing through a narrow canyon. Nothing frightening, simply strange. Radar technicians rechecked every log. There was no sign of malfunction, no indication of a storm, no interference. The signal hadn't broken apart. It had simply ceased to exist, the way the village population dwindled to zero in Chapter 3, the way the children's footprints ended in Chapter 5, the way the explorer's trail blurred into moss and fog. Another journey paused mid-motion. Another familiar path interrupted. Tonight, as we open this chapter of the sky, imagine yourself seated near the wing of that plane, not in fear, but in calm. Outside the window, clouds drift like soft blankets. The engine hum is steady, almost hypnotic. Inside, passengers rest easily, unaware of the mystery that history will one day whisper about. There is no shock in this moment, only quiet, only cloud, only sky. Everything looks normal, and soon the story will carry us gently into the next part, where we follow the searchers who rose into that same sky, hoping to find what the clouds had quietly taken.
When search teams arrived at the small coastal airport the next morning, the sky was still the same color it had been the night before, a soft blanket of gray, stretched from horizon to horizon. Nothing about it looked dangerous. Nothing suggested that somewhere above those clouds, an entire aircraft had slipped silently out of existence. Helicopters were the first to rise, lifting slowly into the morning air with rotors that hummed steadily, almost respectfully. Pilots were briefed to follow the planned flight path, a narrow arc that passed over gentle waves, quiet coves, and eventually the deeper waters where the silent ship of Chapter 1 had once been found drifting without its crew. The similarity was not lost on anyone. Two disappearances, separated by decades, sharing the same restless strip of sea. As the helicopters climbed higher, clouds thickened into a milky curtain. The ocean below blurred until it looked like a single sheet of pewter. Normally, search crews would look for broken pieces of metal, bright patches of fuel, or something as small as a floating life jacket. But that day, visibility was so low that even the water beneath them felt imagined, like they were flying above an empty page waiting to be written on. Radio chatter remained calm. Moving north, passing waypoint 2, cloud layer persistent. Nothing alarming, and yet the absence of anything, any clue, any anomaly, created a soft tension in the air. It reminded one of the rescuers of a story his grandmother used to tell him about an old village that had slowly emptied itself house by house. He didn't remember the details, only the quietness of the tale. He didn't know he was thinking of the village from Chapter 3. Down on the shore, boats moved out in synchronized lines. The sea was calm, but unnaturally still. Not a single bird circled overhead. Even the waves that usually lapped playfully at the hulls moved with a deliberate slowness, as though careful not to disturb something beneath them. By early afternoon, the search expanded inland. Teens in jeeps drove along forested paths that twisted toward foothills that miles farther would rise into the mist-shrouded mountains where the explorer from Chapter 6 had vanished into fog years earlier. The rescue maps showed his last recorded route marked with faint dotted lines. Now those old coordinates overlapped with the estimated last signal of the missing plane, as if two stories had quietly brushed against one another in the same lonely corner of the world. One of the search leaders paused when he noticed the overlap. He didn't believe in patterns, not in a mystical sense, but he did believe in landscapes, how certain regions held weather the same way valleys held water, how fog behaved like an old inhabitant of a place, returning again and again to familiar ground. As he looked at the map, he murmured,
it's the same fog belt. And it was. The same drifting veil that swallowed the explorer's footsteps. The same dim curtain that had hovered above the sea on the night the plane disappeared. Late in the afternoon, sunlight finally pressed gently against the clouds, turning them from gray to a faint gold. For a moment, visibility improved. Helicopters dipped lower. Boats scanned faster. Ground teams raised binoculars. It felt like the world was offering them a window, a chance, and yet nothing appeared. No glint of metal, no torn fabric, no hollow echo from the mountains, just distance, just quiet, just the soft breath of wind. As dusk approached, teams began returning. Their movements were methodical, not discouraged, just tired in the way people get when searching for something delicate, something that might break if handled too suddenly. A few of them lingered by the water before heading back. The sky above them was turning violet, and for a moment, the ocean reflected it so completely that sea and sky became the same color. One rescuer whispered that it made him think of the children from Chapter 5, the way their footprints had ended in snow, leaving only silence behind. Another noted that the pilot's last words, "Everything looks normal," felt like the quiet sigh of a story pausing mid-sentence. No one said it aloud, but they felt it. This disappearance, like the others, carried the same gentle strangeness, the same unfinished breath. As the final helicopter descended and its lights blinked softly against the darkening air, the night felt heavier, not frightening, just full, like it was holding something close to its chest, something it was not ready to release. And once again, the sky told no secrets. Night settled fully over the coast by the time the search teams returned to the command post. It was a modest building, more like a wooden shelter than a headquarters, but that evening it felt like the quiet center of a story no one yet understood. Lamps glowed softly along its walls, casting warm circles of light that barely held back the fading blue of dusk. Inside, maps were spread across long tables. Red markers traced the flight path. Blue lines followed the currents of the sea. Yellow pins indicated the search zones that had been combed carefully just hours before. None of them had produced a single clue. A technician played back the final radio message from the plane, not out of hope for a new discovery, but simply because people often revisit the last normal thing before everything became strange. The pilot's voice sounded steady, almost calm, as though he were reading a familiar grocery list. Everything looks normal. And then silence. Not a scream, not a shout, not a strange sound in the cabin. Just nothing. One of the investigators leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes slowly. He had worked aviation disappearance cases before, and he knew the familiar pattern. Panic, malfunction, a sudden drop in altitude, distress signals flooding the communication lines. But this time, the absence of distress felt more mysterious than any emergency could. As he stared at the map, he traced the dotted path into the open sea and further inland toward the Highland region, an area marked in pale ink because it rarely appeared in aviation charts. He whispered, "Same weather, same fog." Someone nearby nodded. Another added softly, "Same coast the ship drifted from." No one wanted to say it, but all of them were thinking it. Different stories, different decades, different people, and yet the same stillness, the same gentle unraveling of a journey that never finished. Outside, the temperature dropped. The night breeze moved through the grass with a soft, rhythmic hush, like the ocean breathing just beyond the hill. A few rescuers stepped out for air. They stood quietly, hands in pockets, eyes turned upward toward the sky that had swallowed a plane whole. The stars were faint that night, half hidden behind veils of drifting cloud. One of the volunteers, a young woman who had never worked a major disappearance before, asked in a whisper, "How does something that big just vanish?" Her voice wasn't frightened, only puzzled, like she was asking why certain dreams fade the moment you wake up. The older rescuer beside her spoke gently, "Not everything disappears loudly." And somehow, that sentence lingered in the air longer than the wind did. Back inside, the teams reviewed weather data. Satellite images showed thick cloud layers along the coast, shifting slowly like a living thing. Patterns of wind suggested that turbulence could have occurred, but nothing severe enough to tear a plane apart. It was as though the craft had slipped into another layer of the world, something parallel, something quiet. But no one dared to say that aloud. Instead, they turned back to the maps to check markers near the old mountain trails. The same trails where an explorer walked into dense fog and never stepped out again. His last coordinates were circled in faint pencil, and next to them, written in small letters, were the words, "Visibility near zero." A strange coincidence. Or maybe not. A soft knock at the door drew everyone's attention. It was one of the coastal boat captains. His thick coat was damp from sea spray, his boots leaving small prints on the wooden floor. "Nothing on the water," he said simply. "Not a scrap." His tone wasn't hopeless, just tired. Tired in that way people get when they've been listening to the same silence for too long. As the captain left, one of the officers murmured, "It's like the sea and sky agreed to keep this one." No one responded, but the room felt heavier for a moment, like the walls themselves understood the meaning. Close to midnight, the search teams finally paused for rest. Some lay on benches, others leaned against their backpacks. A few watched the coastline from the windows, where moonlight shimmered faintly on the waves. From above, the scene might have looked peaceful, almost serene. But beneath that calm lay a familiar thread. The same thread that connected the ship at sea, the missing family, the emptying village, the vanished children, and the explorer swallowed by fog. It was the thread of stillness, the quiet echo of a journey paused forever. One officer looked at the radar screen one last time before closing the equipment for the night. The blank green sweep circled again and again, showing no more than the coastline outline. He whispered, like the train in Chapter 4, like the ship, it just never reached the end. And in that gentle observation, the chapter found its close, not with fear, but with acceptance. Some stories end loudly, others drift softly into the night, becoming part of the quiet. And tonight, the sky kept its secret with the same tenderness the sea had kept before it. High in the mountains, where the wind carries a thin, whistling note, and the world narrows to white horizons, a small wooden shelter sat quietly beneath a heavy roof of snow. It wasn't much more than a cabin, 4 walls, a simple door, and a window that looked out toward a valley swallowed by winter. But that night, it was the only warm place for miles. A lantern glowed inside, still half full of oil, still warm when rescuers found it. A blanket lay folded, untouched, on a narrow bed. A pot of water sat beside the stove, faintly warm, as if someone had heated it not long before disappearing. And near the door, the snow had been swept away by human hands, recently, gently, leaving only a few stray crystals that glimmered faintly under the light. Everything suggested someone had been here. Everything suggested they had planned to stay. Yet the cabin was empty, just like the house of the family in Chapter 2, just like the homes in the village that emptied itself in Chapter 3, the same quiet feeling of a place left behind too suddenly, too completely. The rescuers followed the only clue, a line of footprints leading away from the cabin, neat and calm, spaced like those of someone simply walking, not running, not fleeing, just walking into the night. The footprints were small enough to belong to a single adult, perhaps carrying little more than a coat. They led down a gentle slope, then curved slightly toward the north, where the mountain fog often drifted between the trees like a living veil. One rescuer whispered that the footprints reminded him of the children's prints in Chapter 5, the delicate marks in fresh snow that went on and then simply stopped. He didn't say the comparison aloud again, but it lingered like a soft echo in his mind. As they continued along the trail, the rescuers noted the silence, the kind that makes snow seem thicker, deeper, the kind that settles against your thoughts rather than your ears. Even the wind seemed hesitant, rising only in thin breaths that rattled the branches lightly before fading. The air was cold enough to sting the skin, but not stormy, calm, just like the sea in Chapter 1. Just like the night the family disappeared in Chapter 2. Just like the quiet that hung over the abandoned village in Chapter 3. A pattern returning, not loudly, but softly, almost gently. After about an hour, the footprints led the team to a ridge where the mountain dropped sharply into a narrow ravine. The trees closed in tightly here, tall and thin, their branches heavy with frost. The fog thickened, as though waiting. The marks in the snow continued a little farther, then abruptly ended.
Not smudged, not scattered, just stopped, as if the person had taken one last step and the night had quietly removed every trace that should have followed. One rescuer knelt beside the final print. He brushed his glove lightly along its edge, noticing how perfect it still was. No signs of a collapse, no drag marks, no sign that the person had slipped or fallen. Just a final step pointed gently toward the ravine. Another rescuer murmured, "Maybe he turned back?" But they all knew he hadn't. There were no returning prints, only the one path leading away from the cabin, away from warmth, away from safety, into the cold. A cold that had swallowed the explorer in Chapter 6, a fog that had mirrored the night sky where the plane vanished in Chapter 7, a quiet that resembled the emptiness inside the ship from Chapter 1. Not identical, but familiar, softly familiar. They stood in that stillness for a long moment. No one moved, no one spoke. Snowflakes drifted around them, slow and gentle, landing on their coats like fragments of a story they couldn't quite read. And they realized something subtle. This wasn't a place of panic. This wasn't a scene of struggle. It was simply a moment where a journey had paused. The last visible step of a story swallowed by winter. The same way so many journeys in this night's stories had paused, mid-ocean, mid-road, mid-air, mid-life. When the rescuers turned back toward the cabin, the sky above them was turning the faintest shade of silver, the first suggestion of dawn behind a curtain of fog. The world was still silent, still cold, still holding the shape of something unfinished. And behind them, that single line of footprints lay in the snow, leading nowhere, ending nowhere, pointing gently into the quiet.
The rescuers took a slow breath as they stood before the final footprint. The sky above the ridge had softened into a pale wash of gray, the kind of light that belongs neither to night nor to dawn. It was the hour when the world holds its breath, unsure which way the day will lean. One of them gently brushed snow from a nearby branch, revealing a layer of ice beneath that glinted faintly like old glass. That thin sheet of ice reminded him of frost patterns they'd found in the abandoned village of Chapter 3, where windows had held the cold like silent memories. Here, too, the ice felt like a memory, one left behind by someone who had walked into the night without a sound. The team moved slowly around the ridge, searching for any continuation of the trail. They scanned the surrounding trees, traced the slopes with careful eyes, and pressed their boots gently into the snow so as not to disturb any faint impressions that might still be hiding beneath the surface. But there was nothing. No partial prints, no broken branches, no sign that the person had stumbled, rolled, or climbed. Just an end. A boundary where the physical world no longer held a record of the steps that had once been taken. One rescuer took out a small notebook, a habit from years of fieldwork, and jotted down a few quiet observations. Prints consistent, path steady, no deviation, no distress. His handwriting was slow, deliberate, as if each word had weight. He paused before writing the last note, then added, "Last step facing the fog." They all felt the significance of it, though none spoke it aloud. Facing the fog, that familiar drifting presence that had appeared in so many stories tonight. The fog that had swallowed the ship's horizon in Chapter 1, that had blurred the fields around the vanished family in Chapter 2, that had hung low over the empty village roads in Chapter 3, that had hovered along the train tracks in Chapter 4, that had followed the children's steps in Chapter 5, that had consumed the explorer in Chapter 6, and that had cloaked the sky in Chapter 7 just before the plane disappeared from radar. Fog was never the culprit. It didn't take, it didn't chase, but it had always been there, soft, patient, and strangely constant. Now it stood before them again. The rescuers approached the edge of the ridge where the fog was thickest. It drifted upward slowly, like a tide coming in, curling around rocks and tree trunks, brushing against the snow with a gentleness that felt almost intentional. The world beyond it was blurred into a shape without form, without depth, like a place between places. Someone whispered, "Why would he walk into that?" Another answered softly, "Maybe he didn't see it as danger." And in truth, the footprints had not suggested fear. They suggested purpose, or at least acceptance, a quiet willingness to follow something only he understood. The team set up a safety line and descended a few meters into the ravine, but the fog grew thicker with each step. The rope sagged, collecting frost. Their lights reflected back at them, turning the world into a soft white glow that hid more than it revealed. They reached the bottom, only to find untouched snow. No footprints, no disturbance, no sign that anyone had descended that way. It was as if the mountain itself had refused to record anything more. As they stood there, surrounded by the muffled quiet, one rescuer felt a strange familiarity, like he had been in this silence before. Not this place, but this feeling, the gentle surrender of a story that didn't want to end loudly. He thought of the plane that never landed, the train passenger who left no trace, the explorer whose journal ended with hope for clear skies, the children whose small boots walked into the evening air, the villagers whose lives simply folded into the landscape, the family who left their door unlocked, the ship that drifted without a soul aboard, and now this, the last footsteps in the snow. Each story was different, each person had walked a different path, but the endings all shared a softness, a quiet pause, as if the world itself had exhaled and let them go gently. There were no sharp edges in these disappearances, no chaos, no violence, only stillness. Perhaps that was what made them linger so deeply. When the rescuers climbed back up to the ridge, the fog had shifted slightly, revealing a thin sliver of sky, a muted silver stretching above the mountain. It was calm, comforting, almost warm in its quiet neutrality. One of them whispered, "Wherever he went, I hope it was peaceful." And somehow, standing there, in the hush of morning, with the last footprint behind them, it felt possible. The mountain did not give answers, but it did not feel threatening. It felt like a place where stories rested, where footsteps ended not in fear, but in silence. And silence, they realized, could sometimes be gentle. The rescuers made their way back toward the cabin, moving slowly through the soft morning light that filtered through the fog like diluted silver. The world felt fragile in that hour, as if every sound might break the stillness holding the mountain together. Their boots pressed gently into the snow, leaving temporary marks that the wind would erase before long. Behind them, the last footprint remained untouched, cradled by the fog and the pale glow of dawn. When they reached the cabin, they paused again. The lantern inside had finally gone cold. The blanket on the bed looked softer under the dim light, as though waiting for someone who had stepped out only to return a moment later. The air inside was still warm enough to remember him, but not warm enough to hold his presence. One rescuer rested a hand on the wooden door frame, feeling the faint chill of the night still clinging to the wood. It reminded her of the unlocked door from Chapter 2, the one the family had left behind without a sign of panic. It reminded another rescuer of the houses in the emptying village of Chapter 3, places left standing as though waiting for footsteps that never returned. It even echoed, quietly, the ship from Chapter 1, found drifting with warm coffee and untouched meals, a pattern of shelters abandoned mid-breath, each one holding a small pause where life had once been. Outside, the wind shifted and carried with it the faintest whisper of moving air, stirring loose snow into tiny spirals. The rescuers turned toward the mountain ridge once more. The fog was thinning now, lifting slowly in pale ribbons that revealed the wider landscape, snowy slopes, stony cliffs, and the long path leading into the valley where no more footprints continued. The world looked peaceful, completely, achingly peaceful, but that peace carried a weight, the weight of a story that had chosen silence over explanation. One of them murmured, "It's like he stepped into the quiet." They all felt it, not that he had run, not that he had struggled, just that he had walked into a stillness deeper than the one he left behind. They gathered their gear and began the descent down the mountain. The sun was climbing slowly, casting soft light on the snowfields and turning the frost on branches into delicate threads of gold. The valley stretched wide below them, the kind of landscape that humbled even those who had walked it their entire lives. As they moved, each rescuer carried their own string of memories, moments from other disappearances that had quietly threaded themselves together through the night. The gentle roll of the abandoned ship, the quiet house with the lights turned off, the village with its silent school and empty chapel, the train seat that held a suitcase but no passenger, the children's small footprints ending in snow, the explorer's last journal entry promising hope, the plane's calm final message, and now the cabin in the mountains with its final footprint pointing toward the fog. Each story stood alone, yet together they formed a kind of quiet constellation, points of stillness across land, sea, and sky, not connected by cause, but by feeling, not by fear, but the soft hum of journeys that paused in places where the world itself seemed to fold inward. When they reached the base of the mountain, the fog had lifted completely. The sky above was clear in a way it hadn't been for days, a pale, washed-out blue that held no threat, no omen, just openness. The rescuers looked back one last time. The ridge was still there. The cabin still stood. The final footprint was out of sight, but they all knew exactly where it lay, as if its presence had imprinted on their thoughts. One rescuer whispered what the others were thinking. Some endings aren't meant to be solved, just witnessed. Another added softly,
maybe he found something we're not supposed to understand. And in that moment, with the mountain resting under the brightening sky, the thought didn't feel frightening. It felt gentle. Perhaps the person had walked into the fog the way one walks into a memory, or a dream, or a silence that finally matched the one inside their own heart. Perhaps each disappearance in this night's tale had been that kind of quiet crossing, a step from the world of noise into a place where things simply fade softly. As the team headed back toward the valley road, the narrator's voice, soft, slow, steady, would close the chapter with the same tenderness that had filled every part of this journey. Perhaps there is no single thread connecting these 8 quiet vanishings. Or perhaps, like your thoughts tonight, the patterns are meant to fade gently into the dark,